So this week we are going to look at fractions through baking. So I'm actually going to walk you through how to create a recipe that is 1.5 for some M&M cookies. So I'm going to walk you through the math on how we would do that to figure out how much we would need of each ingredient. And then I'm going to actually walk you through how to bake the cookies. So I'm really excited. So grab a pen, grab a paper. You know, we're going to get cooking and it's going to be really exciting. The unfortunate part is by the end of the video, you will sadly not have any cookies and I will, but I will make sure I enjoy one for each and every one of you.
All right, so this is the recipe that we're going to end up making today. So they're for soft and chewy M&M cookies. As you can see, it calls for your standard ingredients. And so we have our current fractions listed here on the side. But we're gonna make a recipe and a half. So in order to do that, the first thing I did was I looked at, well, what would half a recipe be? Because I need to know what the halves are in order to add it to what is currently there. So for flour, it called for the 1.5 cups. I converted it into a mixed fraction. So I could divide it by 2, but dividing by 2 is the same as multiplying by 1/2. So each of these ends up being multiplied by 1/2. And when you multiply fractions, you multiply straight across. So 3 times 1 is 3 and 2 times 2 is 4. So half of 1 1/2 is actually 3/4. So I did the same thing going all the way down. If I didn't already have a fraction, then that made it really easy. So like 1 teaspoon divided by 2 is just half a teaspoon. But same thing here. So here I needed to multiply by a half, multiply by a half. So I figured out what are all of the halves going all the way down. Where it got a little weird is like here when we have brown sugar, a half of 1/3 is 1/6. So if you were just making half a recipe, there's not a 1/6 cup in the measuring things. So what I would do is actually take a 1/3 cup and kind of split it in half, like literally actually like have it in half and just kind of be like, yeah, it looks about right. It gets really weird when you also try to convert an egg. So you need half an egg. I would just do that in a separate bowl and kind of take out approximately half. I do not cook with eggs. So I did a ground flaxseed egg. So what it is, it's flaxseed and it's just all ground up. And what I do is I mix it with water. So this is the current way to replace 1 egg. So for me to make half of an egg replacement, this is the measurements that I would use. So I did the same thing again for vanilla and the M&Ms. So we have the half recipe going all the way down. So then what we're gonna do is I'm gonna take so I took each of the measurements that the original recipe called for, and I'm going to add the half that I figured out. So 1 1/2 plus 3/4. Well, in order to add fractions, I need a common denominator. So 1/2 becomes 2/4, and I add it together. So I have 2/4 plus 3/4 gives me the 5/4. I didn't have an extra whole, so I just carry my 1 whole. But then the issue becomes, well, 4/4 is 1 whole. So I actually do have another whole once I add it together. So I'm going to take that out. So now I have 2 wholes. But when I take out 4 of the 5 that I have, I end up with 1/4 left. So I'm going to actually use 2 1/4 cups flour. Same thing here. I have, 1 teaspoon plus 1/2. This one, because I have a whole and a fraction, when I combine it, I don't have to do any more simplification. It's just 1 1/2. Here, again, I need a common denominator. So my common denominator is 4. So 2/4 plus 1/4 is 3/4. Do the same thing with 4ths and 8ths. So I just kind of continue doing that all the way down. So now that we have the new recipes for our 1.5 recipe, let's get cooking.
So according to the recipe, it says 1.5 tablespoons of the flaxseed. So what I like to do for the 1 tablespoon, that's easy. Okay, so I'm just putting it into a little bowl because I'm going to do it first because it takes a little bit to set. So to do the half part, I still keep my tablespoon. I'm honestly just going to kind of eyeball it. So that looks like a half to me. So that's what we're going to do. And then for the water, it calls for 3.75 tablespoons. So again, the first 3 tablespoons is going to be easy. And And now for the 0.75, it's almost 4. It's not quite, so I'm gonna mostly fill it up, but not get it quite all the way to the top. And so then all I do is I mix it up. And so it looks a little watery. You guys can see in the video, it looks a little watery right now. But as I finish doing all the other stuff with the cookies, it's gonna set up. It typically takes anywhere between like 5 to 7 minutes. So let's move on to the other parts. All right, so the next thing you wanna do is you wanna combine all of your dry ingredients. So based on the math that we did earlier, we're going to need 2 1/4 cups of flour. So I'm gonna go ahead and do that. All right, so now that we have our flour, we then want to add in the salt. So our recipe for again, because we're making 1.5 batches, so this is gonna call for 3/8 of a tablespoon. So 3/8 is almost 4/8, which would be a half. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna use my 1/2 tablespoon, but I'm not gonna quite get it all the way up to a half because I don't have an 1/8 tablespoon thing. If you do, awesome. But I don't. So I'm just gonna kind of look at it. It's almost a half. So I'm gonna go ahead and dump that in. The next thing that's gonna go in here is going to be the baking powder. So remember when baking, there is a difference between baking powder and baking soda. Sometimes you get, a recipe calls for one or the other. So for baking powder, we're doing 1.5 teaspoons. So there's 2 ways you can do this. So that's the cool thing about fractions. One, I don't like to use a lot of dishes. So I might use just the 1/2 tablespoon, because if I want 1, I would just do 2 of the halves and then, a 3rd one. Or if I wasn't feeling confident, I would get out the 1 teaspoon and then do the 1/2 teaspoon. But I'm going to kind of save on some dishes and just use the 1/2 teaspoon. So I'm gonna need 3 of these. And I always wanna double check because you never wanna mix up baking powder and baking soda. I did that once with waffles. Maybe it was pancakes. Either way, it was nasty. So, all right, so I'm gonna need 3 of these. All right, so we've got the baking powder done. So the next thing is we have baking soda. So that calls for 3/4 of a teaspoon. So I'm gonna switch over to my 4th teaspoon and just count out 3. All right, so now that we have all the dry ingredients put together, because you never just want to toss them in, you want to whisk them all together, which I totally forgot to get my whisk out. There it is, luckily the drawer's right here. And I'm just gonna whisk it all up. All right, there's all my dry ingredients. All right, so if you've never looked at butter before, butter has these tablespoon markings, and then it also has cups on it. So according to our recipe, we need 3/4 cup. So we can kind of count, so there's 1/4. So the 2/4 is the 1/2 cup. So I'm gonna need a whole stick here, but I'm not gonna need a full other stick. I'm only gonna need 1/2 of this. So I'm gonna cut the 1/4. What I love about butter is they have little lines here so that you can figure out how much you need. So now I'm only gonna need this much butter. I'm gonna go put this little 1/2 in the fridge. All right, so now we're on to the sugars. So for brown sugar, it's gonna call for 1/2 cup, and then for the white sugar, it's behind me, it's gonna call for 3/4 of a cup. So again, I don't like to use a lot of dishes because baking already in general has way too many dishes. So what I'm gonna do is, because I can make a 1/2 cup out of a 1/4 cup, and then I can just use, same one here. So I'm gonna use the 1/4 cup for the brown sugar. And then for the white sugar, this is the one that called for the 3/4 cups. So I'm gonna measure out 3 of these. By knowing your fractions with baking, it definitely helps in not using as many measuring things. All right, so now the next thing we're gonna add in is, if you were using eggs, now would be the time to add in your eggs. So this is where I'm going to add in the flaxseed egg that we had from earlier. So one thing to do, so you can kind of tell there's a little bit of water that's on top. So I just like to stir up the ground flaxseed. So I'm going to add in my ground flaxseed. And the next thing we're gonna do is add in our vanilla, which according to our recipe is 3 teaspoons. Once I have all that in, I'm going to turn on the mixer and mix it really well until it's all combined. All right, so our recipe calls for 2 1/4 cups of M&Ms. And if we look, I pretty much have it, in like straighten it out, but I pretty much have that in here. And half of that is gonna go into the batter. The other half is going to be on top. So to split this in half, well, 2 cups cut in half is 1 cup. So it's about 1 cup there. So into the batter it goes. And then for a 1/4 cup, to cut that in half, well, I'm going to take my 1/4 cup here. It's a little some sugar on it from earlier. And I'm just going to do, you know, I like a lot of M&Ms in my cookies, so it looks fine. Plus my 1 cup was a little short. So then I'm just going to turn on the mixer. All right, so I always like to bake with a parchment paper over the cookie sheet. I didn't grow up using it that way, but it's magical also. Cookie scoops, magical things. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna take one, I'm gonna roll it, whoop, losing M&Ms. That's okay, we're gonna end up adding some M&Ms there. I'm gonna roll it into a ball and then just place there. And then I'm just gonna kind of space them out about 2 inches. Now that I have all of the balls of M&Ms, I'm going to take the leftover M&Ms and the ones that don't have any, I'm going to push them into the side. And this part you want to be generous with, because right now we have spheres, but then as they bake, they're going to become flatter circles. So the surface area is going to be different where the M&Ms are. Now that they're all done, into the oven they go. So as you can see, creating a recipe and a half of cookies is not as difficult as you may think, especially if you figure out the half first, then doing the 1 1/2 isn't that difficult. It is definitely easier to double or triple a recipe, because then you're just either multiplying everything by 2, by 3, or however much you have. So I hope you guys enjoyed baking the cookies. Sorry you don't get to eat any unless you actually went out and got all the stuff and then you make them. If you do end up making the cookies, please let me know how they turn out. Send me pictures, whether it's on Snapchat, through email, whatever it is. I want to know how they turn out. And I will see you guys next week.